A series of reforms have revitalised India's economy in recent years. Among the most significant, and certainly one of the hardest to negotiate, was the enactment in July of a unified sales tax structure across all 29 states, wiping out a Byzantine network of individual state regimes that entangled business operations and gummed up supply chains. To talk about this and other highlights of the global outlook, I'm joined once again by Mike Jakeman from our global forecasting team.
Hi, Alistair.
Hi, Mike. So this general sales tax, a big change for India. It's a couple of months ago now, but we're beginning now to see it in action. Tell us how it's working and what we expect it to mean for the outlook for India over the coming years.
Sure. So what tends to happen when governments make big changes to tax structures is that people's personal consumption patterns change slightly. If you're intending to buy a big item and you know that tax is going up, you'll probably pull the purchase forward or push it backwards. So you get some sort of short-term disruption. But we're going to try and look through that as far as the India forecast is concerned, because the GST is much bigger than that. This is a reform that economists have called for decades, and the previous system was extremely inefficient, as you've suggested. As you tend to get with enormous pieces of legislation, there are compromises across the board with this. So goods, it's not as if goods are all now taxed at the same rate. You get certain categories that are taxed much higher than others. Restaurants pay different rates depending, for example, if they're air conditioned or not. So there are some flaws to this that will mean that India's tax structure is still not as smooth as it could be. But this is a positive thing for the economy. Government revenue is going to rise significantly as a result of this, which of course then means the onus then returns to the government to decide how to spend this money most effectively. But this is a step forward. And in general, our outlook for India is pretty positive at the moment. This is an economy that should be growing in the late sevens or low eights in the next 5 years, which is much better than it was doing 3 or 4 years ago. However, I would say there is sort of a big caveat for India, and this applies to when it's, you often get people say that India is the BRIC economy that's performing the best in recent years. Obviously, Brazil and Russia have been in recession, and China is in long-term slowdown, and India is therefore the bright spark. Well, external and global conditions have really suited India for the last couple of years. The global oil price falling was a big boon to GDP because India is a big energy importer. But these conditions aren't going to last forever. Oil prices will eventually rise a little bit, and some of the external financing conditions will get a bit more expensive once the Fed starts raising rates, or as the Fed continues to raise rates in the next few years. So the trick for India is to keep growing at this rate, even after the external conditions are less helpful, which is as we expect them to be in the next few years. This is obviously an economy that was growing at almost 10% prior to the global financial crisis, so you could argue that although 8% sounds stellar in the kind of current global context, that India is perhaps capable of a bit more.
Okay, I mean, I suppose it's all about really the direction. It's great to have sort of stellar growth, but it's at least good to be moving fairly quickly, which India is.
Of course, it's also about job creation as well, because this is still a young population, and each year the economy needs to grow by this sort of between 7 and 8% just to absorb the number and provide jobs for the number of new entrants into the labour market. So that's an important challenge for the government, perhaps the most important challenge in the next couple of years.
Okay. Well, talking of job creation, let's move across to the United States, obviously the world's biggest economy, where job creation, as Donald Trump keeps reminding us, is going great guns. Employment has been one of the sort of bright spots in the US economy recently. Interestingly, though, it doesn't seem to be feeding through into wages and from there into inflation, and this is sort of complicating the story for the Fed, which is thinking obviously about the direction of monetary policy. What are the complications there for the Fed? How do we see this playing out, and what are the implications for the US economy over the next few years?
Yeah, this is a real puzzle, because job creation, as you said, has been going great guns, much faster, in fact, than I would necessarily have expected at this point in the business cycle. So unemployment is now down to the low fours, which is tends to be about as low as it gets in recent cycles in the US. And yet job creation has been above 200,000 a month for 5 of the last 7 months. I mean, it's still growing very rapidly. And it also hasn't yet led to any acceleration in wages. So for the last 2 years, average nominal wage growth has been 2.5%. We haven't seen any increase in that at all in that period, despite unemployment falling from the mid-6s to the low 4s. the sort of unavoidable conclusion from this, I think, and this is partly why we've sort of changed our forecast this month, is the idea that the natural rate of unemployment, the structural level, is a lot lower than it was before the financial crisis. There are some quite technical reasons for that, I think. What it means is that we'll carry on seeing this unemployment rate fall. We'll see more job creation in the next few months. And then eventually we'll hit a point where inflation starts to pick up quite quickly, I think. Perhaps not as quickly as it has done at this point or that point in previous cycles, but we will see some faster inflation. And that means that the Fed's got this sort of tricky decision to do, because the Fed wants to raise rates as much as it possibly can without slowing the economy too much, because it wants this insurance for when the next recession arrives that it can provide some stimulus to the economy because by cutting the policy rate. So they've said so far that they will look through this period of slow inflation, and they've picked out a couple of reasons why they think it might be that there's some changes to telecom pricing structures and things like this that they think are influencing it. We think they'll still raise rates in December, which is probably the next realistic opportunity. And then we'll try and raise rates another 3 times next year if they possibly can. But the sort of significant change to our forecast is that we were expecting a US downturn in 2019. We've shifted that out by a year now to early 2020. And that's related to this labour market. It's the idea that there is more slack in the labour market than we thought. Unemployment's going to go lower, so down to perhaps a low of between sort of 3.5% and 3.8%, something like that. That's going to hold inflation down for longer. And then what will happen perhaps by 2020 is the economy will start to overheat. The Fed will then start to raise rates more aggressively, and that will tip the business cycle into a recession. So it's a similar kind of call we had before. We've right. pushed it back 12 months on account of there being less wage pressure in the economy than we previously thought.
Okay, so the Fed tightening is going to come. It's just going to come a bit more slowly and a bit later on in the cycle than we thought. Another
really important point to note on this is the fact that financial markets aren't expecting the Fed to tighten anywhere near as aggressively as we think they're likely to. Bond yields would suggest that actually financial markets aren't expecting very much Fed action at all in the next 2 years, whereas I think we'll see this rate hike in December and then 2 or 3 next year. So what that's going to do is put some upward pressure on the dollar as well, and it could cause some emerging markets to look a bit worried, I think, about the state of their currencies and their debt repayments.
Okay, well, that's one to keep an eye on over the next few months. There's a nettle, I think, that we need to grasp at this point. The administration, while the economy sort of rumbles on, the administration seems to be stumbling from one PR pothole to another, and the political scene in the United States has got incredibly noisy. It's very, very hard to get a clear, cool sense of what's going on. So what I wanted to ask you was, can you give us a clear assessment of what we see the prospects of the survival of the Trump administration as being?
Gosh. So there's going to come a crunch point, I think, for Republicans in Congress, where their patience with Trump and the threat that having a dysfunctional administration poses to them getting their legislative agenda through Congress, and that's what really matters to Republicans, is can they take advantage of the fact that they have the presidency and they have majorities in 2 houses of Congress to change America in the way they want to. They're going to come a point where they have to say, is Trump going to help us do this, or is he getting in the way to such an extent that we need to do something about it? That's complicated by the fact that we've got midterm elections at the end of 2018, and by the fact that there is this very serious a probe into potential Russian ties between Donald Trump and the Russian state, which could, in a sense, force Republicans' hands. But I think this crunch point is coming. It's very difficult to forecast when that's going to happen, or indeed how Republicans will fall one way or the other. I mean, it's worth repeating that no president has been forced from office through impeachment. 2 presidents have been impeached, but neither in the House, but neither have left after the Senate trial. So it is very, very unlikely. Then again, we're in unprecedented times. I don't feel that Trump's behaviour is at all presidential. I also wouldn't. It's worth considering the risk he might resign were Republicans to quite clearly turn against him. I don't really feel like it's in his nature to sit through a full impeachment process. I think he'd be more likely to try and turn the narrative into how he's a victim of a witch hunt and his plans to make America great again have been thwarted by things beyond his control. That said, he is still a Republican president who is more likely than not going to sign off the bills that the Republican Congress put in front of him. So the central forecast is that he still survives, but undoubtedly the risk of him leaving office has risen in the last few months. I mean, I think resignation is now at least as likely as impeachment, but the central scenario remains that he stays in office for the full 4 years, but the prospect of them getting very much done is very low, particularly given this added distraction of the Russia probe, which is very serious and has the possibility to end in a sort of a protracted legal stalemate or to worsen ties between the White House and the Republican Congress sort of irredeemably.
Okay, well, I'm sure we'll be coming back to that over the months ahead.
Sure.
But let's leave that aside for the moment. Come back across the Atlantic. Let's look at Europe, finish off there. It looks and it feels like it may be a sustainable, sort of fairly broadly based recovery that's happening in Europe, Brexit aside. So leaving the UK out, what's the prospect in Europe? How do things look to you at the moment?
I mean, sort of opposite to the unhappy political situation in the US, we've got a very good economic situation in Europe. We've revised up our Eurozone economic growth forecast several times in recent months. We now think that 2017 is going to be the best year for the Eurozone since 2011. It's going to grow by more than 2%. This is quite impressive stuff. I think the difference, and why we're talking about this now as opposed to 2 years ago, is not that we had a group of countries 2 years ago that were growing at 2%. The difference is that there are now fewer that are dragging this aggregate down. So countries that were performing poorly 2 years ago, like Austria and France, have started to grow more quickly this year, and they're exerting less of a lag on the aggregate. Why? Well, obviously, trade is helping. The more you're surrounded by economies that are growing more quickly, the greater the demand for your exports, and the more you kind of get sucked into it as well. Unemployment levels are falling every month. Each month is now a new low since the financial crisis. Sentiment has been pulled up a bit by elections of mainstream candidates in Europe. It wasn't that long ago that we were talking about the threat of populists all across the continent. I'm not sure how sustainable it's going to be. We don't have another year of 2% plus growth plugged into our forecast because it's very hard for countries like Spain to continue to grow at the current rate of almost 3.5% for very long. And also some of the structural factors that we've talked about for a long time in Europe, demographics, and the failure to make really deep structural reforms will begin to have an effect in sort of towards the end of our forecast period. But this is a very good period for Europe, and it's great to be able to revise up our forecast rather than down, because this is a region where we've been very negative on for a very long time. Political risk is still there. You mentioned Brexit. We still think Greece is going to leave at some point over the next 5 years, and all of this populist sentiment hasn't gone away. But undoubtedly, having a more impressive and stronger growing economy will help to combat some of that, perhaps.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Mike. That's it for this month. Please do join us again next month for another look at the global outlook. Thank you.